She didn't even look at him when she said it. She looked at the man standing behind him, younger, cleaner, with smooth hands that had never held anything harder than a whiskey glass, and she smiled like Silas Rourke wasn't even worth the air between them. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said, loud enough for the whole trading post to hear. "A man your age, following a girl half your life, it's pathetic." Silas didn't move, didn't flinch. He'd been called worse by better people in worse places. But something about the way she laughed, the way the younger man laughed, with her carved something out of him that he hadn't even known was still there. He turned around and walked back into the snow. He didn't know that 3 weeks later, a dying woman would fall out of the sky and into his life and rearrange everything he thought he understood about surviving. If you've ever been made to feel like you were too old to matter to someone, stay with me. Because this story isn't about age. It's about what happens when two broken people stop running from each other. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story like this one. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The cold that January was the kind that didn't just sit on your skin. It got inside your bones and stayed there, like it had decided to take up permanent residence and wasn't interested in negotiating. Silas Rourke had lived through 31 winters in the Blackthorn Range, and he still didn't have a word for what January felt like up here. Cold wasn't sufficient. Cold was what you said to describe a drafty room or a glass of lemonade left on the porch too long. What January did in the Blackthorn was kill, quietly, methodically, without the slightest bit of personal feeling about it. Silas respected that. He'd modeled most of his adult life after it. He was 53 years old, and he looked every single year of it. The scar that ran from his left ear down to the corner of his jaw had faded to a dull silver, a gift from a trapping accident 17 years back that had nearly taken his eye along with it. His beard was the color of dirty iron. His hands were so calloused they barely registered temperature anymore, which was either a practical advantage or a warning sign, depending on how you looked at it. He lived alone. Had lived alone for 19 years, since the last time he'd tried anything different, and learned the particular lesson that came from that experiment. He didn't discuss that period of his life. He didn't think about it if he could help it. He'd built his cabin, set his trap lines, smoked his meat, and arranged his existence into something that worked the way a well-maintained tool works, dependably, without surprises, without much joy either. But that had stopped feeling like a complaint somewhere around year 4. He was checking the eastern line that morning when he heard it. Not a sound you could easily describe, something between a crash and a groan like timber giving way but wrong, out of rhythm, coming from something that had been moving instead of standing still. His hand went to the rifle on his back before the rest of him had fully processed the noise. He stood still, listened. The wind dropped for exactly 3 seconds, the way it sometimes did up here, like the mountain was catching its breath. In that silence, he heard something else, hooves struggling. Then nothing. He moved toward the sound without deciding to. That was how survival worked up here. You didn't deliberate, you responded, and you figured out afterward whether the decision had been smart. Timber was dense this close to the ridge. The spruce trees packed so tightly that midday looked like early dusk, and the snow between them was waist-deep in spots, crusted hard enough on top to fool you into thinking you could walk on it until your leg punched through and the cold hit you like a blade. He heard the horse before he saw it, a bay mare, dark as old mahogany, sinking in the snow about 40 yards into the trees. She was still trying. That was the part that got him, even though he was not a man who was easily gotten. She was still trying, still pushing with legs that had nothing left in them, still trying to get somewhere, and every second she tried, she was only sinking deeper. He came around the left side of a spruce trunk and saw the rider. Or rather, he saw where the rider had been. There was a depression in the snow, shaped wrong, like something had hit it hard and sudden. He tracked from the horse to the depression and found the person face down in a drift that had swallowed them to the waist. Not moving, Silas covered the distance in about 10 seconds flat. He grabbed a shoulder and turned the body over and found himself looking at a woman. Young, 20-something, maybe. Hard to tell under the circumstances because what he was mostly looking at was blue skin and eyelashes that had frost on them, and lips the color of bad news. "Hey," he said it louder than he meant to. "Hey, nothing." He pulled off his right glove and pressed 2 fingers under her jaw. There was a pulse, but it had the quality of something that hadn't made up its mind yet. Behind him, the horse made a sound that he would think about later, when he had the luxury of thinking about things. The mare had stopped moving. She was lying down now, and the way she was lying down told him everything he needed to know. Horses that go down in deep snow like that in January don't come back up. Silas looked at the woman in his arms. He looked at the tree line. At the sky, which had turned the flat gray-white color, that meant the next wave of the storm was maybe 2 hours out, maybe less. He looked back down at the woman. She was wearing men's clothes. Heavy wool coat, trousers that were at least 2 sizes too large, boots that had been resoled so many times the original leather was just a memory underneath. No hat, no gloves. Whoever she'd been riding toward, she'd been riding hard and she hadn't been prepared, or she had been prepared and then something had gone wrong with the preparation. He made the decision the way he made most decisions in the back country, fast and without sentiment. He got her over his shoulder. She weighed less than she should have. That was the first thing he registered about her as a person rather than as a problem. She was too light. Whatever she'd been living on before she came over that ridge, it hadn't been enough. He didn't go back for anything from the horse. There was nothing on the horse worth the time it would cost him in temperature. He carried her for 40 minutes through the timber. He didn't think about much during those 40 minutes. He thought about foot placement. He thought about the angle of the wind. He thought about the fact that if he slipped on the ice shelf at the creek crossing, he was going to go down with 200-odd pounds of combined weight on uncertain footing, and that would be a bad end to a bad morning. He thought about his wood supply and whether he had enough dry kindling split and whether the fire had dropped while he was out. He did not think about who she was or where she'd come from or whether she had anyone looking for her. Those were questions for later. The only question that mattered right now was the one the mountain always asked first. Are you going to make it back or not? He made it back. The fire had dropped to coals but not gone out. He laid her on the floor in front of the stove, not the cot, the floor, because he needed her on a flat, hard surface where he could work, and he started stripping the wet clothing off her with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of a man who had treated frostbite and hypothermia before, in himself and in the occasional fool who'd crossed his path up here over the years. Skin was bad. Not the worst he'd ever seen, but bad. The color was wrong in her extremities, and her core temperature was dangerously low, which he estimated from the way her shivering had stopped, which was not a good sign. Not at all. Because shivering meant your body was still fighting, and the absence of it meant you were past fighting. He wrapped her in the 2 wool blankets he kept for himself. Then he added his coat on top. Then he started heating water, not to boiling, just to warm, and he filled both of his stone crocks and wrapped them and packed them against her sides. He sat on the floor next to her and watched her breathe. That was the work. That was all of it. You couldn't rush warming a person. You did it too fast and you shocked the heart. You did it right, and you waited, and you watched, and you didn't sleep, and eventually either they came back or they didn't. Silas Rourke had not prayed since his mid-30s. He didn't start now, but he watched her breathe with more attention than he'd given to anything that wasn't directly keeping him alive in a very long time. She came back in stages. The color started first. The blue in her lips gave ground slowly, like something that didn't want to give up its territory. Her fingers twitched around 3 in the morning. She made a sound around 4, not a word, not even close to a word, just a sound that meant something in her was reconnecting to something else. Silas refilled the stone crocks with fresh warm water and repositioned them without disturbing her and went back to watching. Just before first light, her eyes opened. They were the color of creek water in spring, that particular gray-green that changes depending on what light is hitting it. He noticed that specifically, which surprised him, because he was not a man who noticed colors in people's eyes. They opened, and they immediately went wide, and her right hand shot out and grabbed for something that wasn't there, and he realized she'd been reaching for a weapon. "Easy," he said. Her eyes found him. She didn't relax, not exactly. But she stopped grabbing for the absent weapon and just looked at him with the particular expression of someone running rapid calculations in their head. Where her voice cracked and failed, he was already holding the tin cup. He'd had water ready for when she woke up, because he'd known she'd need it, and he was not a man who made the same practical error twice. He held it out to her. She looked at the cup, looked at him. She took it with both hands. Her hands were still shaking, and drank. "Blackthorn Range," he said, answering the question she hadn't finished. "My cabin, about 4 miles north of Cutter's Creek, if that means anything to you." She processed that. Her eyes moved around the cabin without moving her head, taking inventory the way someone does when they're assessing exits and threats and resources all at once. He recognized the reflex. He had it himself, "My horse," she said. He held her gaze. He'd learned a long time ago that there was no kind way to deliver certain facts. The kindest thing you could do was say them clearly and without decoration. She went down in the timber. She was already gone when I left her. The woman closed her eyes, kept them closed for about 5 seconds. When she opened them again, whatever she'd felt in those 5 seconds was already back behind something. "Pass," she said. "What about it?" He'd known what she was asking before she'd finished asking it. "There's another system coming in today. The pass is going to be buried under 10, maybe 12 feet of drift by tonight. That's if the wind cooperates, which it won't." He watched her face. "You're not going anywhere for a while." She stared at him. He stared back. "Your horse is dead," he said again. "The mountains got us both until the snow decides to let go. That's your situation. That's my situation. Neither one of us chose it." He stood up because his knees ached from sitting on the floor, and he was too old to pretend otherwise. "I've got dried meat and some barley in the crock. You need to eat something before you sleep again." She was still watching him with that expression, not quite suspicious, not quite grateful, somewhere between them. Like a woman who'd been handed something she couldn't yet determine the price of. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked. He had the answer ready, because it was the simplest true answer he had. "Because you were going to die in my timber if I didn't. And I don't have any use for a dead stranger in my tree line in January." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a terrible reason," she said. "It got you out of the snow," he said. "You can argue about the quality of it later." Something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile. Not even close, really, but it wasn't the blankness of fear either, and he decided that was sufficient for now. "My name is Maeve," she said. "Maeve Hollister." He went to the stove and picked up the ladle. "Silas Rourke," he said. He didn't ask her anything else that morning. He'd learned in the particular hard school that life in the Blackthorn provided that information came out when it was ready, and not a second before. Pushing it was like pushing frozen ground. You just broke your tools and exhausted yourself, and the ground didn't move anyway. He fed her, and she slept, and outside. The storm came down the way it had promised to come down, heavy and without mercy, and completely indifferent to the two strangers, sitting inside the one small structure that stood between them and everything the mountain was prepared to do. Silas banked the fire and sat in his chair by the window and listened to the wind find every seam in the cabin walls, the way it always did, the way he'd gotten so used to he barely registered it anymore. He looked at the woman asleep on his floor, wrapped in every blanket he owned. He looked out the window at the white fury of the passing storm. Then he looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, useful hands that had kept one person alive up here for 19 years, and he thought about provisions. He thought about wood. He thought about the trap line and the smokehouse and the barley situation and how long a January storm of this magnitude typically ran. He thought about all of it with the hard, practical part of his brain that had never let him down. He did not think about the color of her eyes. He was extremely certain about that. Outside, the storm buried everything that had come before, and the mountain, ancient and terrible and entirely without opinion about the two human beings sitting out its temper inside a handful of logs and clay, did what it had always done. It kept going, and it waited, and it let the cold decide everything else. The morning after the storm passed, Silas woke up and found Maeve sitting at his table. Not lying on the floor where he'd left her, not resting on the cot he'd finally moved her to sometime around midnight. She was sitting at his table with her back straight and both hands wrapped around a tin cup of water, and she was looking at the wall like she was reading something written on it that he couldn't see. He stood in the doorway of the sleeping area for a moment and said nothing. She didn't startle. She'd heard him, he could tell by the slight shift in her shoulders, but she hadn't jumped, hadn't grabbed for anything, hadn't turned around with that same wild animal panic he'd seen in her eyes the day before. She just acknowledged him with her body without making a production of it. He decided that was interesting, and then he decided to stop deciding things about her and went to check the fire. "You shouldn't be sitting up," he said. "I've been sitting up for 20 minutes and nothing fell off," she said. "I think I'll survive it. Your core temperature dropped low enough yesterday that—" "I know what hypothermia is." She said it without heat, without defensiveness. Just a flat statement of fact. "I also know I need to move or my muscles are going to lock up and then I'll genuinely be useless." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those gray-green eyes that had entirely too much awareness in them for a woman who'd been half dead less than 12 hours ago. He went to the stove and stirred the coals. "There's barley left from last night," he said. "And I've got some smoked venison. It'll be tough. I'll eat it." He didn't say anything else. He put the pot on and stood there watching the heat come back up, and she sat at his table and didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary words. And that more than anything else that first morning was what made him think she might actually be manageable. Silas Rourke did not like noise, not the noise of weather, not the noise of machinery, and specifically not the noise of people who talked to cover the fact that they were nervous. He'd known men up here who chatted constantly, about nothing, about everything, a running stream of words to prove they weren't afraid of the quiet. Those men usually didn't last long in the Blackthorn. The mountain had no patience for performance. Maeve Hollister sat in his cabin and was quiet, and something in the rigid set of his jaw loosened by about 10%. The storm had left 3 additional feet of snow on top of what was already there, and when he went out after breakfast to check the state of the pass and assess the wood situation, he came back with confirmation of what he'd already known. They weren't going anywhere. Not for weeks at minimum. The pass road was invisible. There was no pass road. There was just a white landscape that looked exactly like every other part of the white landscape, and somewhere under 15 feet of compacted snow and ice was the trail that led down toward Red Hollow and everything below the range. He told her when he came back in, stomping snow from his boots at the threshold. "Weeks," she repeated, "at minimum, more likely longer." He hung his coat. "February's going to come in hard. It usually does after a January like this." She absorbed that. He watched her do it. Watched her take the information and process it the way you process something you don't like but have to accommodate. There was no panic, no outburst, no demand that he find some other solution. She just sat with it. "Your food stores," she said finally. "What's the situation?" It wasn't quite a question. It was more like someone who'd already run the numbers in their head and was confirming their math. "I stocked for 1 person," he said. "How long through April?" "Comfortably. But comfortably for 1 person through April is different from 2 people through April on the same stores," she finished. She nodded slowly. "What are you running trap lines on?" He looked at her. "Rabbit primarily," he said, "some marten. The beaver lodges on the North Fork." "Why?" "Because if you're running active lines, we're not just eating what's in the store," she said. "Which changes the calculation." She looked up at him. "I'm not going to sit here and eat your winter provisions and do nothing about it." That's not something I'm willing to do. You nearly died yesterday. And today I didn't, she said so. He studied her for a long moment. The oversized coat had dried overnight, and she was wearing it again, with one of his flannel shirts underneath that drowned her to the knees. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and there were still shadows under her eyes deep enough to look bruised. And she was sitting at his table with the posture of someone who had decided that her situation was a problem to be solved and had already started solving it. You know trapping, he said. It wasn't a question. Something in the way she'd used the vocabulary had already told him. Enough, she said. He let it sit. He didn't press her on it, partly because he'd made a rule about that in the first days, no questions about where she'd come from. What she'd been doing on that horse in January, with no hat and no gloves, and partly because he suspected that the answers would complicate his thinking, and he was trying to keep his thinking uncomplicated right now. What he needed was to get through the winter. That was the only job. Everything else was background noise. The first real test came on the 4th day. He'd been out checking the east line and came back to find her in his workshop area, the corner of the cabin where he kept his equipment, his skinning tools, his repair kit, and she had one of his rabbit snares laid out on the work table and was retwisting a section of the wire that had weakened at a joint. His first response was a flash of something that wasn't quite anger, but was related to it. The kind of feeling you get when someone moves something in your space without asking, when the order of things that only make sense to you is suddenly disturbed by someone else's hands. He stood in the doorway and watched her work. Her hands were sure. She twisted the wire with the specific, practiced grip of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply, where the weak points in a snare were most likely to develop, how tight the closure joint needed to be to hold under snow load. She wasn't guessing, she wasn't experimenting. That snare was fine, he said. She didn't look up. The closure joint was starting to go. Another week, and it would have slipped on you in the field. I would have noticed it in the field. You would have noticed it when it let something go that you needed to keep, she said. She'd set the repaired snare on the table and picked up the next one in the row she'd laid out. I noticed it when I could fix it before it cost you anything. He stood there for another moment. He was aware that he should probably say something about the presumption of her going through his equipment without asking. He was also aware that she'd been right about the snare he'd been planning to check the lines next week, and he very well might have noticed it in the field after it had failed, which was exactly as useful as she'd said. Put his coat on the hook and went to build up the fire. She fixed 3 snares that afternoon and didn't say anything about having done it. He ate his dinner looking at the repaired equipment lined up neatly on the work table and thought that he couldn't decide whether he was irritated or relieved, and the fact that he couldn't decide irritated him further. The second week was harder than the first in ways he hadn't anticipated. Not practically. Practically, Maeve had been telling the simple truth. She wasn't a burden. She kept the stove fed while he worked outside. She maintained a level of order in the cabin that was, if he was being honest, slightly better than the order he maintained on his own, not because she was tidier by nature. He didn't think. But because 2 people in a small space creates pressures that one person never has to address. When you're alone, you can leave your boots where you took them off and your coat over the chair and your tools wherever you last used them, because you know where everything is. When there's someone else in the space, you start putting things where they're supposed to be, because otherwise you spend half your time apologizing for the tripping hazard. He wasn't sure when he'd started putting his boots in the same spot every time. He just noticed one day that he was doing it. What was harder was the quiet. Not because there wasn't enough of it, there was. There was the same deep, layered quiet that had characterized the last 19 winters in this cabin. Broken only by wind and fire, and the occasional crack of the cold snapping a branch somewhere in the timber. What was harder was that the quiet was different now. It had a different quality to it. It wasn't the quiet of one person alone in a space, which is really no kind of quiet at all, because that quiet you stop hearing after the first year, it just becomes the sound of your own life going on. This was the quiet of two people choosing not to speak. That's a completely different thing. That quiet has weight to it. It takes up room. He noticed it most in the evenings, when the work was done and the fire was banked and there was nothing left to do but sit with whatever there was to sit with. Silas had always read. In the evenings he had a small collection of books, mostly technical things, a couple of history volumes, one novel that a trapper passing through had left behind 8 years ago that he'd read 4 times without entirely understanding why he kept going back to it. He'd pull out one of the books and sit in his chair by the window and read by lantern light, and that had always been sufficient. The reading and the quiet and the fire. Now he'd pull out a book and sit in his chair and be aware, at an almost physical level, of another person 6 feet away on the other side of the table, and the awareness made the reading harder. Not impossible, just harder. Like trying to sleep when you know someone else is awake in the room. He didn't say anything about it, because what would he say? Maeve, for her part, seemed comfortable enough in the evenings. She'd taken to mending in the evenings, working through both of their damaged clothes with thread and needles she'd found in his supply box, systematically addressing tears and loose buttons and worn elbows that he'd been ignoring in the particular way you ignore small maintenance tasks when there's no one to notice them. He'd come in one morning to find a shirt he'd been rotating out of heavy use because the right cuff had torn away from the sleeve, and it was sitting on his cot with the cuff reattached and the seam reinforced in a way that was significantly more competent than he would have managed himself. He'd picked up the shirt and looked at it for a moment. "You didn't have to do that," he said when she came back in from the outhouse. "I was sitting there anyway," she said. He put the shirt on. It fit right for the first time in 2 seasons. She was already moving past him toward the stove and didn't see him stand there with his hand on the repaired cuff for just a second longer than was warranted. The end of the second week brought the first real conversation they'd had since the day she woke up. He hadn't intended it. He'd come in from the north line with 3 rabbits, and she'd been waiting with the skinning board already set up, which he'd told her to do and which she'd remembered, and they'd worked side by side in the way they'd been working silently, efficiently, each doing the parts they'd settled into without discussing the settling when she said, out of nowhere, "You've been up here 19 years?" He pulled the hide on the second rabbit. "Near enough. Before that he kept working. Before that I was other places." She nodded. She was working the first skin loose without tearing it, which required patience and the right angle of tension, and she was doing it correctly without having been shown. He noticed that and filed it next to all the other things he'd filed about her. "I'm not asking to be nosy," she said, which was exactly what someone who was being nosy would say. But the way she said it was different, flat, almost apologetic. "I'm just trying to. I'm sitting in your space. I'm eating your food and sleeping on your furniture. I don't know anything about you, and it seems like I should know something. You know I run trap lines," he said. "You know where the dry wood is stacked. You know where the spare blankets are. That's most of what you need to know." She was quiet for a moment. "What happened to your face?" she asked. He looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, which most people didn't do when they asked about the scar, because most people asked about it as an opening for something else and couldn't hold the eye contact when they got a straight look back. Maeve held it. "Trap accident," he said, 17 years ago. Steel joka trap hung up in a tree, came loose when I was working it free. Hit me on the way down." She nodded. No comment about how terrible that must have been. No expression of theatrical sympathy. Just received the information and moved on. "Does it still hurt?" "Sometimes. When it's very cold," she nodded again. Went back to her work. "I had a husband," she said, 2 minutes later. He didn't respond to that. He waited. "He wasn't a bad man," she said. "I think that's important to say. He wasn't," she paused. "He wasn't the kind of bad that's easy to name. He just had ideas about what I was supposed to be, and he had a very clear way of reminding me when I wasn't being it." She rolled the finished skin and set it on the board. After 4 years, I stopped being able to tell where his ideas ended and where I was supposed to start. So I left. Where were you headed, he asked, when your horse went down? Red Hollow, she said. I have a cousin there, Elsa. She wrote me letters for 2 years saying I should come. I finally decided to take her up on it a beat in January. In January, he said, I didn't have a lot of options about the timing. He thought about that. He looked at the oversized coat she'd been wearing when he found her a man's coat, too large, which meant she'd taken it from somewhere in a hurry or hadn't been given time to find her own. The boots with 7 Rizzolines, the missing weapon she'd grabbed for when she woke up. He didn't ask about any of it. Your cousin, he said. She'll be there in spring. Maeve looked at him. Something in her expression shifted a small thing, barely visible, but he was becoming accustomed to reading the small shifts. You think I'll make it to spring? I think we'll make it to spring, he said, and then went back to the third rabbit and didn't say anything else. 3 weeks in, she asked to come on the trap line. He said no. She said, why? He said, because the east line runs 8 miles and the terrain between the third and fourth sets is dangerous in this snowpack, and I don't know what you can handle. She looked at him, and he expected an argument, and instead she said, the west line then. I've watched you map it. It's shorter, and the terrain is cleaner. He opened his mouth to say no again, and she said, Silas, I am going to go out of my mind sitting in this cabin. I am not asking permission to take a holiday. I am asking to do useful work. He closed his mouth. The next morning he took her on the west line. She moved well, better than he expected, which he'd told himself not to have expectations about, but there they were. She read the snow, correctly knew how to test her weight before committing to it, knew to watch the tree canopy for signs of load that might drop, knew to keep him in her sight line without crowding him. At the 4th set, she crouched down and read the sign around a triggered snare with her head cocked and then said, Fox came through. Sprung it from the wrong angle. You want to reposition it or move the set entirely? He looked at her. Move the set, he said. There's a run another 20 yards north along the ridge line. I saw it, she said, and started resetting the snare. He stood there and watched her and had the very specific experience of not knowing what to do with himself, which was not an experience he'd had in a long time. February came in the way he'd said it would, hard, fast, and with a particular viciousness that suggested the mountain had been storing up its complaints and had decided to voice them all at once. Temperatures dropped to depths that made January look mild. The kind of cold that turned moisture in your lungs to ice if you breathed too deep too fast. The kind of cold that split trees audibly in the night, a sound like a rifle shot every few hours, that had startled him badly when he first came up here, and now just meant it was February. Maeve startled the first time she heard it. She was in her cot. He'd given her the cot fully and taken the sleeping area, and she heard the first tree crack and sat up. He heard her do it. He lay in his sleeping area and listened to the silence stretch out after and then heard her slowly settle again. He didn't say anything. But the next morning he told her what the sound was before she could ask, and she listened and said, I thought something had gotten in. And he said, nothing gets in here, with more certainty than the statement probably warranted. And she made the sound that was still not quite a smile, but was closer to it than it had been in the first week. Things that seemed fixed between them in February. Who cooked what? Who checked what on the line? Who took the outhouse run at first light? How much wood needed to be brought in each day to maintain a consistent temperature? And the fact that she could not sleep without some background noise, and he could not sleep with any, which they'd solved by her taking the spot nearest the stove where the pop and shift of burning wood provided enough ambient sound to satisfy whatever her brain needed without waking him in the back. Things that were not fixed the evenings, the quiet that had weight in it, the way he sometimes looked up from his book and found her already looking at him, and then both of them found something else to look at immediately. He told himself that was just the nature of two people sharing a small space. When there's nowhere else to look, you look at each other. It meant nothing. He read the same page of the history volume 4 times one evening and retained nothing from it. February brought something else, too. Something Silas had been monitoring since she first asked about the food stores and had been hoping the trap lines would solve sufficiently, and had privately accepted about 2 weeks in that the trap lines were helping but not solving. They were going through his stores faster than he'd projected. Not because Maeve was greedy, she ate less than he did, consistently, and he'd had to twice tell her to take more when she was dishing up their meal because whatever she'd been used to before arriving here had apparently set her internal sense of a sufficient portion, significantly lower than what the Blackthorn actually required. The problem was simpler than that. 2 people breathe, and bodies in the cold burn fuel to stay warm at a rate that doesn't respond to rational argument. They were working hard, both of them, and the mountain demanded payment in calories for every hour worked in it. He did the calculation again in the last week of February and came up with numbers he didn't like. He sat with those numbers for 2 days before he told her. When he finally did, sitting at the table after dinner with the lantern between them, she listened without interrupting. He laid out the math plainly, what they had, what they needed, the gap between those 2 figures, the trap line's realistic contribution toward closing that gap. When he was done, she sat quiet for a moment. The beaver lodges on the North Fork, she said. You mentioned those. I haven't worked them yet this winter. Too far out to make the round trip comfortably in daylight. If we do an overnight run, she said, take what we need from the lodge, smoke it at the east shelter on the way back. He looked at her. That's a 2-day trip in February. In this snowpack. I know what month it is, she said, with a flash of something that might have been impatience, or might have been exactly measured confidence. I also know we need the food. How much does a beaver lodge that size run? He told her. She did the math herself in her head, and he watched her do it. That gets us to April, she said, without rationing. Without rationing and without significant loss of condition, he confirmed. She looked at him. When do we leave? He had 4 immediate objections and voiced all of them. She addressed each one with specific, practical responses that were irritatingly reasonable. They went back and forth on it for 20 minutes, not arguing exactly, more like 2 people negotiating the terms of a plan that neither had fully accepted yet, and at the end of it, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. 3 days, he said. I need 3 days to prepare the gear for an overnight run. 3 days, she agreed. He dropped his eyes back down and found her watching him with that gray-green gaze, and for the first time she looked not quite satisfied but close to it. Like someone who had made an argument they weren't certain they'd win and had won it. You're stubborn, he said. You're not the first person to notice, she said. The overnight trip to the North Fork was the first time, Silas thought afterward, that he'd clearly seen what Maeve Hollister was made of. Not because anything went wrong, it did, but that wasn't the point. The point was what she did when it went wrong. They'd made the first day push to the east shelter in good time, and the shelter was intact, and the weather held better than he'd projected. What didn't hold was the ice shelf on the creek crossing on the second morning. Silas had crossed it first, tested it, decided it was solid enough, waved her across, and then watched from the far bank as it gave way under her left foot, not catastrophically, not the full-body plunge he'd heard about from other men, but enough to drop her to the knee in moving water before she'd gotten her weight transferred. She was on the far bank in 4 seconds. She'd moved instinctively, throwing her weight to the right without hesitating. No scrambling, no flailing. She was on solid ice with one soaked leg before either of them had time to make it a crisis. He was already moving toward her. I'm all right, she said, before he'd covered half the distance. Her voice was level. She was already pulling at her boot. Get that off, he said, because water-soaked wool against skin in this temperature was its own kind of emergency. I know that, she said, and got the boot off and was already unwrapping the dry sock she'd learned to pack inside her coat in the first week. On the east line he'd shown her that trick, and she'd adopted it without comment and apparently never forgot it. Crouched next to her and helped work the dry sock on, and then they pulled the wet boot back onto the dry sock and laced it tight, because a wet boot was still better than an exposed foot in a pack. And she stood up and stamped once to settle her footing. "Can you make the rest of the distance?" he asked. "How far to the lodge?" "Quarter mile." "Then yes," she said, and walked. She didn't limp. She didn't slow down. She kept pace with him all the way to the beaver lodge, and worked the ice at the water's edge with him, and hauled out what they needed and did the job completely before she acknowledged that her foot had gone mostly numb, which she reported not with alarm, but with the same flat informational tone she used for everything, as if she was reading from a list. He built a fire at the lodge site and worked the boot back off and got her foot warm against his stomach the fastest way, the only way that worked quickly enough, and she sat there on the snow, looking at the trees and didn't make a sound. Not when the circulation started coming back, which hurt. He knew from experience exactly how much it hurt, and she didn't make a sound. "You could say it hurts," he said. "It hurts," she said. "That better?" He looked up at her. She was looking down at him with the expression that was becoming familiar, that particular quality of dry, not quite humor, that she carried so lightly he sometimes almost missed it. Something happened in the space between those two breaths. He wasn't going to examine it. He put her boot back on and got to his feet and started breaking down the camp. They made it back to the cabin the following afternoon with enough smoked beaver to close the gap in their stores comfortably. He hung the meat and she changed into dry things, and they ate dinner in the same quiet that had been their habit, and he didn't say anything about the creek crossing or what had happened on the snow at the beaver lodge. Neither did she. But that night, lying in the sleeping area listening to the February wind find the seams in the walls the way it always did, he was aware that something had shifted without either of them, shifting it on purpose. And he wasn't sure what to do with that, and he lay there for a long time before he slept. He didn't decide anything that night. He was, in fact, very deliberately not deciding anything. But in the morning she was at the stove before him. She was usually at the stove before him now. Had been for weeks without it ever being discussed, and the fire was up, and the pot was on, and she handed him coffee when he came in without turning around, without asking if he wanted it, because she already knew he wanted it and exactly how he drank it, and he stood there holding the cup for just a moment before he sat down. Outside, the February wind worked at the cabin walls with its usual patience. The cold pressed against every window with the casual, enormous weight of a mountain that had been here before them and would be here long after. Silas drank his coffee and looked at the back of her head while she stirred the pot, and the thought that came to him was so simple and so completely unwelcome that he set the cup down and went to go check the wood supply, which didn't need checking. He stood outside in the February cold for 3 minutes, breathing the air that was cold enough to hurt, and when he came back in, she didn't ask where he'd been or why. Because she was Maeve Hollister, and she understood the difference between things that needed explaining and things that didn't. And somehow that, more than anything else, was the problem. March arrived the way it always did in the Blackthorn, not with any suggestion of warmth or relief, but with a particular kind of violence that felt almost personal. Like the mountain resented the idea that winter might eventually end, and was making its objections known while it still had the strength to make them. The windstorms that came in the first week of March were different from what February had delivered. February's cold was heavy and still, a pressure that sat on everything and crushed it down. March wind was active and mean, coming off the high ridgeline in gusts that hit the cabin walls like something thrown, rattling the window frames and finding gaps in the chinking that Silas had repaired twice already and would apparently need to repair a third time. It came sideways. It came from directions that made no sense. It picked up the snow that had been sitting in the clearing since January and threw it around like it was starting the whole winter over again from the beginning. Silas had firewood to cut. He'd known for 2 weeks that the wood supply was going to be tight through the end of the month. The overnight beaver run had solved the food problem and shifted the pressure elsewhere. And the elsewhere it had shifted to was the fact that heating a cabin for 2 people through a march like this burned wood at a rate that didn't respond to optimism. He'd run the numbers the same way he'd run the food numbers carefully, without sentiment, and what he'd come up with was that he needed 4 more cords before the cold broke, and the trees he had permission of the mountain to take were a quarter-mile northeast, up along the first ridge where the dead-standing timber was accessible without climbing. He'd been waiting for a workable window in the weather. The window came on the 12th of March a morning, where the wind dropped to something manageable, still enough to cut without the gusts, making every felled tree a navigation problem. The sky was the flat, uniform gray of a system moving through rather than sitting, which meant he had maybe 6 hours before the next wave came in. 6 hours was enough. He took the crosscut saw and the splitting maul and told Maeve he'd be back by early afternoon. She was at the work table, doing something with one of the marten traps, and didn't look up. "Don't stay past 4, she said. "The barometric's been dropping since yesterday." He knew that. He'd been watching it too. "I know," he said. "I'm not reminding you because I think you don't know," she said, and looked up then with those gray-green eyes. "I'm reminding you because you have a tendency to work past what you planned, and you've been watching the same barometric, and you'll tell yourself you have another hour when you don't." Put on his coat. "I'll be back by 4, he said. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression that had become familiar, the one that was assessing without being unkind, that was measuring him without reducing him. Then she went back to the marten trap. "Good," she said. He was back at the dead-standing timber by 8:30 and had the first tree down before 9. The crosscut worked cleanly. The tree had been dead 2 seasons, and the wood was dry all the way through, which was what he needed, dense and dry, the kind that would burn long and hot through a March night. He bucked it into lengths, split what he could manage to carry in the first load, stacked it for retrieval, and moved to the second tree. The second tree was bigger, 30 inches at the base, dead but still sound, leaning slightly northeast with the natural lie of the ridge. He set his cut accordingly, working the crosscut in long, clean strokes, reading the wood as it came apart. He'd felled hundreds of trees over 19 winters, and he knew the sounds, the creak that meant the lean was shifting, the groan that meant the fiber was separating the way you'd planned, the deeper crack that meant you had about 3 seconds to move. He heard all 3 of those sounds in the correct order. What he didn't hear, what he couldn't have heard, because the wind had come up in a gust, precisely at the moment it happened, was the secondary limb. A widowmaker, they called them, and the name was accurate, dead wood lodged in the canopy of a falling tree. Unseen until the tree moved and dislodged it, and then it came down with all the speed and weight of something that had been waiting a long time for a target. He was moving out of the fall line when it hit him. Not the limb itself. Directly, he'd partially cleared the zone, and the main impact took him on the left shoulder from an angle rather than overhead. But partially cleared, and an angle, and rather than were distinctions without much practical difference, when what hit you was a dead pine limb, 8 inches in diameter, coming down from 30 feet up. The sound his shoulder made was something he felt more than heard. He was on the ground before he fully understood what had happened. His face was in the snow, and he could smell the spruce needle resin from the broken branch, and his left arm was wrong. Only word his brain produced. Wrong. The arm was wrong. The shoulder was wrong. Something that was supposed to be in a specific place was no longer in that place, and every nerve in the surrounding area was transmitting this information at maximum volume. He lay there for what was probably 15 seconds and felt like considerably longer. Then he got up. He got up because the wind was picking up, and the sky to the northwest had gone a color that meant the 6-hour window had been optimistic. And because lying face down in the snow with a dislocated shoulder, he'd cataloged what had happened to him with clinical efficiency. Because cataloging kept the panic from taking up space was significantly worse than standing up with one. He gathered what he could carry one-handed. The crosscut he left. He picked up the maul because he'd need it more than the saw and carried it in his right hand and started back through the timber. The 40-minute carry he'd done in January with Maeve over his shoulder had been hard. This was different. This was the particular private hell of moving through deep snow in deteriorating weather, with an injury that made every step a negotiation between forward motion and the thing his body wanted to do instead, which was stop and sit down and wait for someone to come along who could help. There was no one to come along. There was only the cabin and the distance between him and it. He walked. He was not a man who talked to himself under normal circumstances, but he talked himself through that walk. Not out loud, just the interior running commentary of someone who has to keep moving and needs something to keep time against. Left foot, right foot, watch the grade on the left. Ice under that crust, don't use the left arm for balance. Reach. Don't, and there was a moment. Somewhere in the middle of the second mile, where the pain crested and his vision went to a white static that had nothing to do with the snow around him, and he stopped walking and stood very still until it passed. Passed. He walked. He heard her before he saw the cabin. She was outside, he registered, that with a spike of something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite alarm, standing in the clearing with her hand up, shading her eyes against the flat gray light, looking northeast, which was the direction he was coming from. She saw him at the same moment he saw her. He watched her, read him from 50 yards. She'd always been able to read him faster than he was comfortable with, accurately enough that it sometimes felt like a violation of something, and she read him now before he'd said a word, or gotten close enough for the details to be clear. He saw the change in her body, not panic. Nothing as uncontrolled as panic, but a shift from waiting to moving, a gathering of purpose that happened all at once. She met him halfway across the clearing. "How bad?" she said. "Shoulders out," he said. "Left." She was already at his left side, not touching, positioning herself to see the way the arm hung. He watched her look at it and saw her understand exactly what she was looking at. "Can you make it inside? I'm standing in front of you, aren't I?" he said. She didn't point out that standing in a clearing and making it the rest of the way to the cabin were two different propositions. She just turned and walked beside him, close enough that if he went down, she'd have a chance at catching some of his weight, and they covered the distance to the cabin without either of them speaking. Inside, she got his coat off the right side normally. The left side with a care and a slowness that told him. She understood that the wrong movement would light up every nerve in his upper body, and she sat him down on the cot and stood in front of him and looked at the shoulder. "I have to see it," she said. He nodded. She helped him get the flannel shirt off, and he sat there in the cold cabin air with his upper body bare and his left shoulder visibly, grotesquely wrong, the joint displaced forward. The contour of the muscle sitting in a shape it wasn't designed to hold, and she looked at it without flinching. Her expression was focused and serious, and he could see her running through something in her head, going through options or procedures or memories, something she was retrieving from somewhere. "Talk to me," he said. "What are you thinking?" "I've seen this in horses," she said. "Two of them." She stopped, started again. "The farm I came from. It happened twice. I watched the procedure both times." He held her eyes. "That's not the same as a human shoulder." "No," she said. "It's not." She didn't try to pretend otherwise. He appreciated that more than he could have said. The joint mechanics are similar, but the positioning is different, and the muscle mass around a human shoulder is it's going to resist differently. She paused. "But the principle is the same. Traction, rotation, reduction. Get the head of the humerus back over the glenoid rim." "You know the terminology I read," she said. There was no defensiveness in it. "I've always read everything I could find." He sat with that for a moment. Outside the cabin, the wind had found its second gear, the one that meant the real system was arriving, and the sound of it against the walls was getting serious. "There's no other option," he said. It wasn't a question. "Pass is under 12 feet of snow," she said. "The nearest settlement is 2 days on foot in good weather." In this, she gestured at the sound of the wind. "No. There's no other option." He nodded. "If you do this wrong," he said, "you can damage the nerve." "I know that. If you damage the axillary nerve, I lose the use of the arm permanently." "I know that too," she said. Her voice hadn't changed. Hadn't risen or tightened. Do you want to not do it and potentially lose the use of the arm anyway, from the dislocation sitting unreduced? Or do you want to try? He looked at her for a long moment. Her face was very close to his. She'd crouched down to look at the shoulder and hadn't moved back up yet, and he could see the fine lines of concentration around her eyes and the set of her jaw, which had a particular quality of someone who was afraid and had decided that the fear was not relevant to the task. She was afraid. He could see it clearly now that he was looking. She was afraid and she was going to do it anyway. "Tell me what you need," he said. She stood up and moved around the cabin with the focused efficiency he'd watched her develop over 2 months. No wasted movement, no hesitation, going straight for what she needed. She brought the leather belt from his coat hook and folded it and pressed it into his right hand. "Bite down on that if you need to," she said, without apology or sentiment, just practical information. She positioned him on the edge of the cot, feet flat on the floor, spine straight. She knelt at his left side and took his left wrist in both of her hands. He felt her grip strong, specific, set exactly where it needed to be, and then she looked up at him. "I need you to relax the shoulder," she said, "as much as you can." "I know that sounds insane. Do it anyway." "I know," he said. "Look at the wall," she said. "Pick a spot on the wall and look at it." He picked a spot, a knot in the log, chest height, slightly left of center. He looked at it. He felt her take a breath. Felt her hand settle his arm into position, downward traction, first, steady and firm, a jerk. A sustained pull that applied enough force to get the muscles to stop fighting the displacement. His body's instinct was to resist it, and he breathed out and didn't. Then the rotation. He didn't bite down on the belt. He'd thought he would, had fully expected to, but what came out of him was a sound that was not a word, and not a scream, something between them. Something that he would have been embarrassed by if there had been any cognitive capacity left over from the pain for embarrassment. And then he heard and felt simultaneously the sound of the shoulder reducing. A wet, heavy, definitive sound, like something clicking back into a lock. The pain dropped from a 10 to a 5 in about 4 seconds. Which still left a 5, but 5 was a number he could work with. He sat there with his eyes closed and just breathed for a moment. He was aware of her hands still on his arm, holding the position, not releasing until she was certain it had held. "Did it go?" she said. "Yes," he said. She released his arm slowly, and he carefully moved it, not a big movement, just a small test of the joint, enough to confirm the head had seated properly. It had. The range was limited by the muscle trauma, which was to be expected and would heal, but the joint was back where it was supposed to be. He opened his eyes. She was still crouched at his left side, her hands now in her lap, and she was looking at his shoulder with an expression that was he didn't have a word for it right away. It took him a moment to identify it as relief so profound it had moved past the usual register into something quieter. "You did it," he said. "The joint cooperated," she said. "Maeve," she looked up at him. "You did it," he said again. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she stood up and went to the stove with the briskness of someone who needed to do something with their hands. He sat on the edge of the cot and worked on getting his breathing back to normal and let her do it. "You need to immobilize it," she said from the stove. "I can make a sling from the flannel, and you shouldn't be moving the arm for at least 2 weeks. Longer if it's still painful, 2 weeks," he said. "Minimum." He thought about the wood supply, the trap lines. The daily work that the Blackthorn required without negotiation or mercy, work that he had been doing for 19 years with 2 functioning arms, and which he could not adequately do with one. She heard the silence. She turned around and looked at him. "I'll run the line," she said. "I know the west line completely. You've taken me on the east line 4 times. I know where the sets are. The east line is 8 miles, and the terrain, I know the terrain." "Alone," he said, "in March, with the systems we're getting." "Yes," she said, simply, without theater, just the word. He started to say something, and she cut him off not rudely, but with the absolute certainty of someone who had already thought through every objection he was going to raise and had decided they were survivable. "Silas," she said, You pulled me out of a snowdrift in January and kept me alive and didn't ask me for anything. You gave me half your food and half your space, and you taught me this mountain." She paused. "Let me do this." He looked at her. Outside, the March storm was working itself up to something serious, and the wind was hitting the cabin now in the sustained sheets that meant hours, not minutes. The lantern on the table swayed on its hook, the third set on the east line, he said finally. The terrain past the frozen creek drops 15 feet on the left side. You don't go past that third set. You pull what's in the first 3 sets and you come back. 4th and 5th sets? They wait, he said. They can wait. She considered that. He could see her negotiating with it, measuring the loss against the safety margin, doing the actual calculation rather than accepting the restriction reflexively. "All right," she said. "First 3 sets and back." "In good weather only," he said. "You check the sky before you leave." "The barometric is moving, then I don't go," she said. "I know how to read the sky, Silas. You taught me." He had. Over the past 2 months, piece by piece, without entirely meaning to, he'd taught her a great many things about this mountain. She made the sling that evening from an old flannel shirt she'd cut up for the purpose. Her hands were efficient and sure, and she tied the support knot with a firmness that suggested she'd thought about the biomechanics before she'd touched the cloth. She helped him into it without ceremony, adjusting the angle until the shoulder sat correctly supported, and then stepped back and looked at her work. "Does that feel right?" she said. He moved his right hand to test the position. "Yes, good." She turned away, Maeve. She stopped. He had no idea what he was going to say. He'd said her name, and now there was a space where something was supposed to follow it, and his brain hadn't provided the content yet. He was looking at her back, at the breadth of her shoulders, under his flannel shirt, at the way she held herself, with the particular posture of someone who'd spent years being smaller than they actually were and was still in the habit of it, and something was pressing up against the inside of his chest with a steady, uncomfortable pressure that he didn't have a name for and didn't particularly want to. "Thank you," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Go to sleep," she said. "You need to sleep." She went to her cot, and he went to the sleeping area and lay down with his arms supported in the sling, listening to the storm deliver everything it had been promising all week. He didn't sleep for a long time. The following days were unlike anything Silas Rourke had experienced in 19 years in the Blackthorn Range, and that was not a statement he made lightly. Given that 19 years in the Blackthorn had included experiences that covered a considerable portion of the available spectrum. What he hadn't experienced not once, not in any form, was being the one who couldn't do the work. He was not good at it. He sat on the stool by the window and watched Maeve come in and go out and come in again carrying what he should have been carrying. And the injury itself was manageable. The pain was something he could sit with. But the watching was a specific variety of torture that he hadn't anticipated and couldn't find a way to make peace with. He helped where he could one-handed tasks, things that didn't require the left arm. He prepped the food. He sharpened blades. He sorted and organized the trap supplies and mended the small equipment that could be mended while sitting. He did everything within the circle of what one arm allowed. It wasn't enough. It would never feel like enough. And she knew he felt that way, and she didn't say anything about it, which was somehow worse than if she'd addressed it directly. She ran the west line on the 3rd day after the injury, when the weather allowed. She was back in under 4 hours with 3 rabbits and a marten, and the calm, matter-of-fact energy of someone who had done the job and done it correctly, and wasn't looking for acknowledgement of that fact. He looked at what she'd brought in, and then looked at her. "How were the sets holding?" he asked. "Second set had some displacement from the wind." I reset it. She laid the game on the work table and started on the skinning without being asked. "The marten run you talked about, near the ridgeline, there's fresh sign. It might be worth adding a set there next week." He picked up the marten with his right hand and looked at the pelt. Clean. The skin was undamaged, which meant she'd handled the clothes out correctly, which was the part that most people got wrong first. "Good catch," he said. She didn't look up from the skinning. But something in her shoulders changed. A small thing. Barely visible. He went back to the stool. On the 6th day, she ran the East Line for the first time alone. He was awake before her that morning and pretended not to be lay in the sleeping area, listening to her move around the main room, hearing the particular sounds of her preparing for a long day out, the check of the pack, the sound of the boots going on, the specific way the door latch lifted when she pulled it. The door opened. Cold air moved through the cabin, even in the back room. She paused. "I'll be back before 4, she said to the closed door of the sleeping area. He hadn't moved, he'd made no sound, and she'd known he was awake anyway. "First 3 sets, he said. "First 3 sets, she confirmed. The door closed. He lay there and listened to the silence of the cabin without her in it, and it was a different silence than the one that had been there before she came, and it was worse in every way. And he lay there with that information and did not know what to do with it. She came back at 3:30 with 5 rabbits and a report on the condition of every set on the first 3 stations, delivered with the specificity of someone who had been paying attention to every detail and knew he would want to know them. She told him about the ice condition at the creek. She told him about a section of the run near the 2nd set where something, fox probably, based on the print size, had been working along the same corridor and was likely to interfere with the catches in the next week. She told him about a place in the timber near the 3rd set where she'd seen, high in a spruce, the beginning of what would become a problematic dead limb situation in another season. He listened to all of it. "You're a good field observer," he said. She stopped moving. It was an odd moment. He hadn't said it to be charming, he didn't do that, had never done that in his life, and wasn't about to start now. He'd said it because it was true, and because true things deserved to be said. She was a good field observer. She'd been good field observer from the first time he'd taken her on the West Line, and she was better now, and the fact of that deserved to be named. She turned around slowly and looked at him. "From you," she said, "I don't know if that's a compliment or just a fact." "Both," he said. She looked at him for another moment. There was something in her face that he was going to have to think about later when he had the capacity for it. Something that was neither the careful, neutral expression she usually wore nor the dry flicker of humor that sometimes crossed it, but something else, something with more material to it. "Go sit down," she said. "Your shoulder's bothering you. I can tell by the way you're holding yourself." "I'll do the skinning. You can sit down," she said. "Let me do the skinning." He sat down. He watched her work, and she was fast and accurate, and the pelts she produced were clean and well handled, and the March wind outside was doing what March wind did, and the fire was keeping the temperature in the cabin at something livable, and the lamp on the table threw its circle of yellow light across both of them and the work between them. He sat there in that light and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives when you've been resisting something long enough that the resistance becomes more effort than acceptance, that the problem wasn't the shoulder. The shoulder would heal. The problem was that his shoulder had healed faster than he wanted it to, because every day it got better was a day closer to the day when Maeve Hollister no longer needed to stay. Every day the mend progressed was one less reason for her to be here. By the time the pass cleared in April, he'd be functional. He'd be able to run both lines. He'd be able to cut wood and carry game and maintain the cabin and do everything he'd been doing for 19 winters without assistance. And she would know that too. And then the only thing keeping her here would be a choice. Her choice, not his. He had nothing to offer in that equation that a woman her age, with her capability and her whole life still ahead of her, should rationally want. He was 53. He was scarred and hard-edged and had spent 2 decades very deliberately removing from himself everything that made a person easy to be around. He lived in a place that tried to kill you every winter and occasionally succeeded. He had no money to speak of, no property beyond this cabin and the timber around it, no connections below the range that amounted to anything. She had a cousin in Red Hollow. She had a whole world below the snow line that she'd come from and could return to. He looked at his hands in his lap, the right one doing everything, the left one resting in the sling, both of them old and scarred and more useful than beautiful. He thought about what it would be like to go back to January, to the particular quality of the silence that had been here before a dying woman had fallen out of the snow into his life. He thought about it for a long time. And when he looked up, Maeve was watching him from across the table, one finished pelt in her hands. The same gray-green eyes with the same quality of attention in them that had been making him uncomfortable since the first morning she'd woken up on his floor. "Stop doing that," she said quietly. He looked at her. "Doing what?" "Whatever you're doing," she said. "Whatever you're deciding in there." She set the pelt down. "I know what it looks like. You get very still and very far away, and whatever you're deciding doesn't look like it's doing you any good." He held her gaze. "I'm not deciding anything," he said. She held his gaze right back and said nothing, which was as clear a way of saying she didn't believe him as he'd ever encountered. He looked at the fire. Outside, March did what March did in the Blackthorn, and inside the cabin was warm, and the lamp threw its circle of light, and Silas Rourke sat in the chair by the window and accepted, for the first time since January, that he was in a considerable amount of trouble that had nothing to do with the shoulder, and everything to do with the woman 6 feet away who had become, without either of them planning it, the reason the cabin felt like something more than 4 walls and a sufficient fire. He was not ready for that. He was also, he suspected with the grim practicality that had kept him alive up here for 19 years, not going to be given a choice about it. The shoulder healed the way Silas healed from everything stubbornly and ahead of schedule, as if his body had decided that vulnerability was an inconvenience it wasn't prepared to tolerate for longer than absolutely necessary. By the 3rd week of March, he could lift the left arm to shoulder height. By the 4th week, he was back on the west line with Maeve, running it beside him, and she watched his movement with the same attention she gave to everything. And when he favored the joint, she noted it without comment and simply adjusted the split of the work without making a ceremony of the adjustment. He resented this slightly and was grateful for it simultaneously, which was becoming a familiar experience where Maeve Hollister was concerned. April arrived with the particular quality of light that the Blackthorn produced when winter was losing its grip, still cold, still hard, but with an angle to the afternoon sun that was different from anything February or March had offered. It came through the cabin window and hit the table at a slant that he hadn't seen in months. He noticed it one morning over coffee, and then noticed that he'd noticed it, and that was the kind of circular awareness that told him his head was not entirely in order. The snowpack was responding, slowly, with the grudging reluctance of something that had held for so long it had forgotten what the alternative was. But the creek levels were rising, and the ice on the North Fork was showing stress fractures, and the drift that had buried the pass road in January was visibly lower, still impassable, still deep enough to make any attempt absurd, but lower, measurably lower. He checked it on a morning in the 1st week of April and stood there looking at it and came back to the cabin without saying anything about what he'd seen. Maeve was sharpening his spare skinning knife when he came in. She'd developed a habit of finding small maintenance tasks in the late morning, the kind of work that kept hands occupied while the mind ran on its own. She was good at the sharpening, better than him at it. Actually, more patient with the angle work, and she didn't look up when he came in. "How's the pass?" she said. He hung his coat lower. She drew the blade along the stone. "How much lower?" "Enough that another 2 warm weeks makes it passable," he said. He went to the stove and poured coffee and stood there with his back to the room. "Maybe less if we get rain." She didn't say anything. He could hear the rhythm of the stone, steady and consistent. "Your cousin," he said, "Elsa, you'll want to get word to her." "She doesn't know I'm here," Maeve said. "She knows I was coming." "She'll have been worried. Red Hollow gets traders through in late April," he said. "When the pass opens, you could move with one of the trading parties. Safer than going alone." The sharpening sound stopped. He didn't turn around. "You've been thinking about this for a while," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation. more like someone identifying a thing they'd suspected and had now confirmed. It makes practical sense, he said. The traders know the trail. You'd have Silas. Her voice had a quality in it that he hadn't heard before. Not sharp, not angry, something quieter than either of those. Turn around. He turned around. She was sitting at the table with the knife and the stone in her hands, and she was looking at him with the gray-green eyes that had stopped surprising him in their directness sometime in February, and had started, sometime in March, doing something different to him entirely. "Are you trying to pack me off?" she said. "Or are you trying to take care of me? Because those are different things, and I need to know which one this is." He held her gaze. "I'm pointing out that you have somewhere to be." "I have someone who expected me," she said. "That's different from somewhere to be." She set the knife and stone down on the table. "I've been here 4 months. I know this mountain. I know this cabin. I know your trap lines and your wood stores and how you take your coffee and the sound you make when your shoulder is bothering you and you're trying to pretend it's not." She paused. "That doesn't feel like nowhere to me." He said nothing. He was very aware that what he said next would determine something, and he didn't trust himself to determine it correctly. "You have a life below the range," he said. "You had one before you came here." "I had a marriage that was suffocating me in a horse, and the clothes on my back," she said flatly. "That's what I had." "You had youth," he said, and then wished he hadn't, because it sounded like what it was, a man building a case against himself before anyone had charged him with anything. She looked at him for a long moment. "How old are you?" she said. 53. "And you think that's the relevant fact," she said. "It's a fact," he said. "It's not the only one, but it's one of them." She stood up from the table. She wasn't tall. She'd always seemed larger than her actual dimensions, which he'd attributed, in his more analytical moments, to the way she carried herself, and she crossed the distance between the table and the stove and stood in front of him and looked up at him the way she'd done when she first woke up on his floor, with that rapid calculation behind the eyes, that quality of assessing something thoroughly and without the buffer of politeness. "Let me ask you something," she said. "All right." "When you found me in that snowdrift in January," she said, "did you think about whether I was too young or too old or too anything before you picked me up?" He looked at her. "No. Why not? Because it wasn't relevant," he said. "The relevant thing was that you were going to die." "Exactly," she said. "The relevant thing." She held his gaze. "I'm trying to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it, instead of building a case around it. Do you understand?" His jaw was tight. He was aware of the tightness and couldn't do much about it. "I hear you. I've lived in a house with a man who saw me a certain way and needed me to stay that way," she said. "He was kind about it sometimes. He was unkind about it other times. But the seeing was always his and the staying was always mine, and I was never once asked which direction I'd choose if I had the actual choice." She paused. "You have never looked at me the way he looked at me." He didn't say anything. "You looked at me like I was a problem to solve," she said, "and then like I was someone who could help solve problems, and then like..." She stopped. "You look at me like I'm a person, a specific one." "That took some time, but you got there." He held her eyes. Something was happening in his chest that he would have diagnosed as a cardiac event if he didn't know better. "Maeve," he said. His voice came out different than he intended. Rougher, lower. "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I'm not asking for forever or easy. I know what this mountain is." "I know what you are." She said it without cruelty, simply as a statement of the facts she'd been living with for 4 months. "I'm asking if you actually want me to go, not if you think I should go." The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, a thrush, the first bird he'd heard since October, called once from somewhere in the timber and then went quiet. He stood in front of her and understood that he had arrived at something he couldn't maneuver around and couldn't outlast, the way he could outlast winter and cold and injury and loneliness, because those things ended eventually if you just kept going. This didn't have an eventually. This was happening right now, in his kitchen, 4 feet from the stove, with the April light coming through the window and hitting the floor between them. No, he said. She waited. No, he said again. I don't want you to go. Something changed in her face. Not a dramatic change. Nothing in Maeve Hollister was ever dramatic. He'd come to understand that as a core feature of who she was, but a release of something that had been held, a very small and very real softening around the eyes. All right then, she said. It won't be easy, he said, immediately, because he was incapable of leaving it alone. This mountain, I've spent 4 months on it, she said. I know what it costs. I'm difficult, he said. I've been alone a long time, and Silas. She said it with a patience that was only slightly exasperated. I reset your shoulder in a blizzard. I've seen difficult. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and for the first time in 20 years, Silas Rourke had absolutely nothing to say, and discovered that the silence had a completely different quality in it than any silence he'd known before. He reached out with his right hand, the one that worked better, the one he trusted more, the old reliable right, and he put it against the side of her face. She didn't startle. She turned into it slightly, the way you turn into warmth when you've been cold for a long time, and the warmth arrives and your body recognizes it before your brain does. I'm not a young man, he said quietly. To me, you're the man who walked 4 miles through a January blizzard carrying a half-dead stranger, she said, and didn't ask for a single thing in return. That's not a young thing or an old thing. That's just who you are. He stood there with his hand against her face and the April light on the floor between them and felt, with a clarity he hadn't had access to in a very long time, that something he had assumed was permanently finished had turned out to be nothing of the kind. He wasn't good at this. He needed her to know that. I don't know how to do this anymore, he said. I've forgotten most of it. I know, she said. I'm not exactly practiced at it going well either. If I get it wrong, then you get it wrong, she said. And you try again. That's how things work. He looked at her. You make it sound simple. No, she said. I make it sound possible. There's a difference. He thought about the 20 years he'd spent making his life smaller and harder until it fit the exact dimensions of what one person could manage alone. He thought about January, about carrying her through the timber and sitting on the floor next to her and watching her breathe, and how he'd told himself every bit of it was practical. He thought about February at the Beaver Lodge, and March with the sling, and every morning in between when she'd had his coffee ready, before he'd asked for it. He thought about the empty cabin that he'd left behind each morning for 19 years and returned to each evening, and never, in all that time, thought of as a problem. He lowered his hand. I need to build a bigger storage shelf, he said. If we're going to winter for 2 people properly, the storage situation is inadequate. She blinked at him once. Then she made a sound that was absolutely a laugh, short, real, surprised out of her, and for the first time in 4 months he heard what Maeve Hollister's laugh sounded like. And it turned out to be one of the least complicated things he'd heard in a long time. All right, she said. The storage shelf and the east wall needs rechinching before next winter, he said. I've been putting it off. You've been putting it off since January, she said. I noticed. They're all Silas. She was still with the almost law in her voice, and the gray-green eyes were doing something he'd never seen them do before, which was to be openly, unreservedly warm. Start with the coffee, then the shelf, then the chinking. One thing at a time. He went and poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat down across from her. And that was what it looked like. Their particular version of everything moving forward, 2 people at a rough-hewn table in a cabin in the Blackthorn Range, drinking black coffee in the April light, with nothing promised and nothing simple, and the whole impossible, necessary business of it ahead of them. He would make mistakes. He already knew that with the certainty of self-knowledge. He would get too quiet, withdraw too far, apply practical solutions to problems that required something else, and she would have to find ways of reaching him that he hadn't yet made easier to navigate. And she would have her own difficulties, he'd watched, enough of her history flicker through in the months they'd been here to know that trust didn't come without cost for her, that the instinct to make herself smaller was one she'd been fighting against all her adult life, and that she'd chosen this mountain partly because the mountain demanded your full size or it killed you, and that the demand had been, for her, a relief. They were not simple people. They were not going to have a simple life. But they were, it turned out, well matched for exactly the kind of complicated they each were. The days that followed had a different quality to them. Not dramatically different. The work was the same. The mountain was the same. The daily negotiation with everything the Blackthorn required continued exactly as it had before. But the silence between them had changed. It had weight still, but now the weight was comfortable instead of careful. When he came in from the line, and she was at the table, and neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes, it was because neither of them needed to, not because they were protecting something. She started sleeping later, not much. 30 minutes maybe, and he started making the first pot of coffee when he got up, which was something he'd never done for anyone in his life, a thing so small it barely counted, but she noticed it. He could tell she noticed it by the way she picked up the cup when she came in, without the slight preparatory pause she'd always had before, the one that said she wasn't quite certain it was for her. The second week of April, they spent 3 days rebuilding the storage shelf together, which meant they spent 3 days in close quarters with tools and wood and the specific friction of two people who both have opinions about how a thing should be built. He wanted to use the shelving method he'd always used: straightforward, functional, adequate. She had ideas about the angle of the support brackets that she'd clearly been thinking about since sometime in February, and she presented them with the flat directness that characterized everything she said. And they went back and forth about it with the efficient heat of two people who don't waste energy on politeness when a practical question is in play. She was right about the brackets. He didn't say that directly. What he did was build the second section using her bracket method and stand back and look at it and say, "That's more stable." And she said, "I know." And that was that. She caught him smiling about something she'd said on the third afternoon and didn't comment on it, but filed it somewhere. He saw her file it. She had a whole filing system for things about him that she'd assembled over 4 months. He was aware of it, was becoming increasingly aware of it, the extent to which she knew him in ways he hadn't authorized and couldn't now revoke. It should have bothered him more than it did. What it did instead was make the cabin feel, on the third afternoon of the storage shelf project, like a place that had been waiting for this specific configuration without knowing it was waiting. The pass opened in the third week of April. He knew it the morning it happened. The sound of the meltwater had been building for a week and a half, the creek going from trickle to run to a sound he could hear from his cot in the morning. And then one night, the temperature swung, and the rain came down for 6 hours, and in the morning the landscape looked different, in a way you couldn't point to specifically, but couldn't miss either. Snow was still there. The drifts were still there. But something had given way in the underlying structure, like a lock turning, and the pass was no longer a wall. He went and looked at it, came back and told her. "I know," she said. She was making breakfast, had her back to him. "I heard it last night when the rain came." He stood in the doorway. "Traders will be through in the next week," he said. "Maybe less. They won't wait once the pass is open, the early ones." She moved the pan on the stove. "I know, your cousin." "I'm going to write her a letter," Maeve said. "She deserves to know I'm alive and where I am. I'll send it with the first trader through." She looked over her shoulder at him. "That's what I'm going to do. Is that what you thought I was going to do?" He looked at her. He had not been certain. That was the truth, and he was old enough and had been wrong enough times in his life to know that certainty about what another person would choose was the specific kind of foolishness that cost you the most. "No," he said honestly. She turned fully around, leaning one hip against the stove. "Silas, I told you what I was choosing. People say things," he said. "And then the pass opens." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he was learning to read as the one she wore when she was deciding how honest to be, how far to go, whether the situation required the full version or a managed one. She decided on the full version. "I've thought about leaving," she said. "I want you to know that. every week since February. I've thought about it. Pass is going to open, and I could go down to Red Hollow, and there'd be regular meals and warm houses and people who don't have 17-year-old scars and 19 years of walls built around every feeling they've ever had. She held his gaze steadily. I've thought about all of that. He waited. And I've thought about this, she said. The West Line, the way you explained the Beaver Lodge to me on that overnight trip before you let yourself admit you trusted me. The shelf with the better brackets, she paused. The morning you made coffee before I got up the first time. You probably thought I didn't notice that. I knew you noticed it, he said. She looked at him. I'm not going to Red Hollow, she said. I'm going to write Elsa a letter, and I'm going to ask her to write me back care of the next trader through, and I'm going to spend the summer learning this mountain in the seasons you haven't shown me yet. She paused. That's all right. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the right thing to say. He thought about the various true things available to him and which of them served this moment. The summer here isn't easy either, he said. I didn't ask for easy, she said. He crossed the kitchen, and she stood her ground, which she always did. And he stood in front of her close enough that the morning light from the window caught the side of her face, and he could see every line of what she'd been through and was still carrying, the same as she could see all of his. All right, he said. All right, she said. He turned and went to get his coat because there was a day's work waiting that wasn't going to do itself. And he was not a man who knew how to stand in a kitchen and feel something without eventually deciding that something else needed his hands. She understood that. He heard her go back to the pan without comment. He was at the door when she said his name. He stopped. Turned. She was looking at him over her shoulder with the gray-green eyes and the expression that was no longer careful or calculated or assessing, but was something else. Something he recognized only because he'd been carrying the same thing in his own chest for weeks without finding a name for it. You asked me once why I was headed to Red Hollow in January, she said. In January with no hat and no gloves on a horse that couldn't make it. He hadn't asked her that. He'd thought it many times and never asked. She knew the difference, and she was acknowledging it. I was running, she said simply. I didn't have a destination so much as I had a direction. Away, she looked at the pan. This is the first place I've been where I stopped running. I think you should know that. He stood at the door with his coat in his hand. She went back to the breakfast. He went outside into the April morning, where the blackthorn was doing what it did at this time of year, releasing its grip on everything, slowly, grudgingly, with the immovable dignity of something that had never been in a hurry. The meltwater ran down the rocks. The trees dripped. Somewhere on the ridge, a bird called that he hadn't heard since last fall, and the sound of it was clear and specific in the morning air. He stood there for a moment. Then he went to check the line, which needed checking, and the morning moved forward the way mornings do when the winter is finally backing down, and the world is, against all previous evidence, choosing to continue. By the last week of April, the first trading party came through the pass, 4 men with 2-pack mules who stopped at the cabin in the early afternoon, in the way traders had occasionally stopped over the years, looking for water and brief shelter from the trail. Silas had always received such visitors with the bare minimum of hospitality required by common sense and sent them on their way as quickly as courtesy allowed. This time, Maeve wrote a letter at the table while the traders rested and asked the lead man, a broad-shouldered Swede named Halverson, who'd been running goods between the settlements for a decade, to carry it through to Red Hollow. Halverson took the letter and tucked it into his inside coat and looked at Silas and then at Maeve and then back at Silas with the specific expression of a man who had seen a great many things in his years on the trail and was adding this to his collection. You're Rourke, he said to Silas, the Blackthorn trapper. I've heard of you. Most people have heard of him, Maeve said, from the table, without looking up from her coffee. Most of what they've heard is accurate. Halverson looked at her with something approaching respect. You're wintering up here? I wintered up here, she said. Now I'm summering up here. Halverson looked at Silas again. Silas looked back at him with the expression that had discouraged supplementary commentary for 19 years, and continued to do so now. Halverson tucked the letter deeper into his coat and moved toward the door. "I'll see the letter gets through," he said. "Obliged," Silas said. After they left, Maeve sat at the table and turned her coffee cup between her hands and didn't say anything for a while, and Silas sat across from her and let the silence run. "She's going to write back," Maeve said finally. "Elsa. She's going to write and ask if I've lost my mind." "What will you tell her?" Maeve looked up. The afternoon light that came through the window, now warmer than it had been, carrying something that was almost a suggestion of summer in its angle, came across her face, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her for weeks without letting himself acknowledge that was what he was doing. "I'll tell her I found somewhere worth staying," she said. He held her gaze. Outside the Blackthorn Range sat in its April afternoon enormous, indifferent, demanding, and occupied, as it had been for 19 winters, by one man who had learned to ask nothing of it except that it let him get through each day. Now there were two of them making that ask. The mountain didn't comment on the change. It never had, and it never would. It would just keep requiring everything they had, every day, with the casual, comprehensive thoroughness that was its one consistent quality. Silas Rourke sat in his cabin in the light of an April afternoon and looked across a rough-hewn table at Maeve Hollister and understood, with the plainest and most uncomplicated certainty he'd had about anything since he was a young man who still believed certainty was available to him, that he was going to give the mountain everything it asked for. He'd just have someone beside him when he did. That was new. That was, he was discovering, considerably better than the alternative. Elsa's letter arrived in May, carried up by Halvorsen on his second run through the pass. Maeve was on the west line when he came through, so Silas took the letter from the trader and set it on the table and didn't touch it again. It wasn't his to open, and it wasn't his business, and he was not a man who complicated simple things. He went back to the storage reorganization he'd been working on and left the letter exactly where it was. When Maeve came in 2 hours later with 4 rabbits and mud on her boots from the creek crossing, she saw it immediately. She stopped inside the door and looked at it the way you look at something you've been waiting for and aren't entirely sure you want now that it's here. She sat down and opened it. He kept working on the storage and didn't watch her read it. He heard the paper, heard the silence while she went through it, heard her exhale once a sound that wasn't quite a sigh and wasn't quite relief, something in between. "She's not angry," Maeve said. "Good. She says she knew something had gone wrong when I didn't arrive by February." She paused, still reading. She asked around Red Hollow. Someone told her there was a trapper in the Blackthorn who'd been up here 20 years and never come down in winter. She says she figured if I was alive, I was probably with him. Another pause. She says she's glad I'm alive. That's a reasonable thing to be glad about, he said. She also stopped. He looked at her. She was holding the letter with both hands, and she was looking at a section of it with an expression he'd learned over the past months to read as the one she wore when something had gotten through the usual defenses. Not many things did. She was well defended in the specific way of someone who had learned exactly what the cost of being undefended was. "What does she say?" he said. Maeve looked up. "She says my husband has been asking after me. Through people she knows in the settlements." The storage shelf became significantly less interesting. Silas put down what he was holding and looked at her fully. "Asking after you how looking?" Maeve said. The word was flat and specific. "He's been telling people I ran, that I left without cause." She looked back at the letter. "Elsa says he's made inquiries at 3 settlements between here and the Eastern Range." Silas was quiet for a moment. He was doing the particular kind of thinking that happened below the level of words, the fast and practical kind, the kind that had kept him alive up here for 20 years. "His name," he said. She looked at him. "Why? Because I'd like to know it." "Harlan," she said. "Harlan, dear." He filed that. "Does he know where you are?" "Elsa says she hasn't told anyone." She folded the letter carefully along its original lines. But if he's systematic about it, and he's systematic about everything. She stopped. He'll work through the settlements. Someone will know. Someone who saw a woman matching my description heading up toward the Blackthorn in January. She set the letter on the table. It's a matter of time. How much time, he said. She thought about it. This summer, she said. Late summer at the earliest. He won't come himself. He doesn't like the outdoors. Never did. But he'll send someone. Silas looked at the letter on the table. He thought about January and the oversized coat and the missing weapon she'd grabbed for when she woke up, and all the things about her arrival that he'd filed away without discussing. He hurt you, he said. Not a question. She was quiet for a moment. That was answer enough. Not in ways that left marks, she said finally. He was too careful for that. He hurt me in the ways that don't show, and then told me I was imagining it. She said it with the flatness of someone who had processed a thing all the way to the bottom and come out the other side of it into something that wasn't quite peace, but was at least solid ground. I stopped being able to tell what was real and what was his version of real. That's when I knew I had to go. He stood there and took that in. What did I want, he said. If he finds you. She looked at him. To bring me back, she said. He's not the kind of man who lets things go. He'd call it caring. He'd call it looking after me. She looked at the window, at the May afternoon outside it. He'd have papers, probably. A husband has legal standing. This isn't a place where paper law carries much weight, Silas said. She looked at him quickly. I don't want you getting into trouble on my... I'm not talking about trouble, he said. I'm talking about the way things work up here. The trading parties make their own rules. The settlements have their own customs. And no man with a hired agent and a piece of paper has ever successfully removed a person from the Blackthorn against their will. He paused. It's terrain. She held his gaze for a moment. You've thought about this kind of thing. I've thought about what I would do if someone came up here looking for trouble, he said. 19 years gives you time to think about contingencies. And what would you do? He picked up what he'd set down and went back to the storage work. Depends on the nature of the trouble, he said, and who it was directed at. Quiet, Silas, she said. Look at me. He looked at her. I don't want this to become something you carry, she said. My past, my husband, and whatever he might send up here. I chose to stay on this mountain, and I understood what that might cost, and I don't want you to... She stopped. Tried again. You took me out of a snowdrift. You don't owe me anything beyond that. He looked at her for a long moment. We covered this, he said. In April. I know. But Maeve. He said it the way you say something when you need a person to actually hear it. I know what I signed up for. She held his gaze. He could see her working through whether to push further and deciding against it, not because she was backing down, but because she recognized when a position was solid. All right, she said. Write Elsa back, he said. Tell her you're well. Tell her where you are so she's not worrying. And tell her to be careful what she says and to whom about your whereabouts. She nodded, and Maeve. He said it to the shelf, not to her face, because some things came out better when you weren't making direct eye contact. You have standing here. Whatever your husband's papers say, whatever he's been telling people, you have standing here. On this mountain in this cabin. He paused. I want that to be clear. The silence that followed was one of those silences with a specific weight in it, the kind that arrives after something that matters has been said plainly, and both people are figuring out what to do with the plainness. Clear, she said quietly. He went back to the shelf. She went to write the letter, and the May afternoon continued outside the window. And the Blackthorn Range absorbed the conversation the way it absorbed everything without comment, without memory, simply by continuing. The summer arrived the way summer does at high elevation, late, compressed, and more beautiful than anything at that altitude had a right to be. June brought green up through the timber in a way that Silas had seen 30-odd times and still noticed. Not with the sentimentality of someone who made things of beauty into occasions, but with the particular attention of a man who spent most of his life outdoors and whose relationship with the natural world was too practical and too long-standing for ceremony, which meant it was also, in its quiet way, too honest for indifference. He noticed the green. He'd always noticed it. He just hadn't previously had someone to not particularly comment on it with. Maeve had her own relationship with the summer mountain that was different from his and interesting to watch develop. She'd come in January when everything was buried and white, and the only information the landscape offered was topographical, where the ground rose and fell, where the timber was dense and where it opened. She'd learned the mountain through its worst face. Now the summer was showing her something else, and she was recalibrating, learning it again in a different register. She was good at that, recalibrating. He'd noticed it as one of her core capabilities, the ability to take in new information and integrate it without the kind of resistance that made some people useless in changing conditions. She didn't need things to be what she'd expected them to be. She could work with what they actually were. He'd been watching that quality in her since February, and it still struck him the same way each time he saw it operate. They extended the trap lines in June, adding the higher elevation sets that weren't accessible in deep snow. She learned those the way she'd learned the winter sets, by going on them, by paying attention, by asking exactly the right questions and no extra ones. He showed her the summer sign that was different from what she'd been reading in winter, the track patterns, the feeding corridors, the way the behavior of everything on the mountain changed when the survival pressure of cold was lifted and creatures were operating on abundance instead of scarcity. Everything's different when there's enough, she said one afternoon on the Upper East Line. She was looking at a Martin Run active, fresh sign, a healthy corridor. Different how, he said. She gestured at the track. In winter, they're desperate. Everything is. Every track you find in deep snow is an animal that's fighting. She looked up at the timber, green and full and dripping from a morning rain. Up here in June, everything is just living. Not fighting, just living. He looked at the same timber. It comes back, he said. Every year. Doesn't matter what February did. She looked at him sidelong. He kept his eyes on the timber. Is that a metaphor, she said. It's an observation, he said, about seasonal patterns. She made a sound that was completely a laugh and went back to examining the run. He smiled at the tree in front of him where she couldn't see it. July brought the first real test of what they were to each other in the day-to-day that wasn't about survival or emergency or the compression of winter quarters. Summer loosened things. There was more daylight, more range, more capacity for the ordinary friction that you don't notice when you're too busy keeping each other alive to notice anything outside the immediate task. He was, as he'd told her in April and meant sincerely, difficult. He knew exactly the ways in which he was difficult and had stopped being interested in excusing them sometime in his late 30s. He talked too little about the things that mattered and too directly about the things that didn't. He had systems for everything where tools lived, in what order tasks were done, how the cabin was organized and the systems made sense and were efficient and were also completely arbitrary in ways that could only be explained by the fact that they were his, and he'd been doing them alone for 20 years. She disturbed the systems, not maliciously, not even carelessly. She disturbed them because she had her own systems that were equally logical and equally arbitrary, and when two people's systems occupy the same space, there are going to be conflicts, and some of those conflicts are about where the skinning knives are stored, and some of them turn out to be about something else. They had an argument in the second week of July that started about the skinning knives and turned into something else. He'd come in from the North Line and reached for the knives in the spot he'd kept them for 19 years, and they weren't there. She'd moved them to a different hook while reorganizing the work wall, a reorganization that was objectively more efficient and that he would have acknowledged was more efficient if he hadn't come in tired and reached for the knives and found empty space. What came out of him was not measured. She came back from the outhouse and found him with a particular quality of silence that she'd learned meant something had gone wrong, and he hadn't sorted it yet. What happened, she said. The knives, he said. She looked at the new hook, where they were. I moved them. The layout makes more sense with the. I know where they are, he said. I found them. What I'm saying is that they were in a specific place for a specific reason. The reason was you'd always put them there, she said. That's a reason. It's a habit, she said. Not a reason. He looked at her. She looked at him. The July evening was warm enough that the cabin door was open and there was actual birdsong coming through it, which was a sound he still wasn't entirely used to hearing in here. When you change where something is, he said, without telling me, I reach for it and it's not there. And I've been reaching for things in specific places for 20 years, and my hands know where they go before my brain does, and when they're not there, it's. He stopped. It's more disorienting than it should be. She was quiet for a moment. You should have just said that, she said, instead of the silence. I'm saying it now. You're saying it now because I came in and asked, she said. If I hadn't come in, you would have sat on it all evening, and we'd have had dinner, and neither of us would have said anything. Tomorrow you'd still be bothered, and I'd know you were bothered, and not know why. He held her gaze. She was right. That was exactly what would have happened. I'll tell you when I'm going to move something, she said. That's a reasonable ask, and you should have asked it in January, instead of waiting for it to become an incident in July. I didn't think about it in January, he said. I know, she said. You were busy deciding I was a temporary problem. She crossed to the stove. And I'll ask you before I move things from now on. But you have to actually tell me when something is wrong instead of going quiet and waiting for me to find it. Considered that. That's harder for me. I know it is, she said, without heat, without the particular patience that is really just contained frustration. Genuinely matter of fact, I'm not asking you to become someone else. I'm asking you to try. He sat down at the table. All right, he said. She put the pan on. He sat there and thought about the fact that he'd had that argument available to him since February, the kernel of it, the shape of it, and had not had it. And the not having it had been a choice he'd made without fully understanding he was making it. The same choice he'd made 10,000 times over 20 years, the choice to manage alone. The problem with managing alone was that it worked, right up until the moment it didn't, and by then you'd spent so long doing it that you'd forgotten what the alternative felt like. He was remembering. The knives can stay where you put them, he said. She looked over her shoulder. Are you sure? No, he said. But I'll get used to it. She turned back to the pan. I'll tell you before I move anything else. That would help, he said. They ate dinner and the argument was over. Not buried over. Resolved into the ongoing negotiation of two specific people sharing a finite space, and the resolution wasn't perfect, and it left some roughness at the edges, and that was fine. That was what it was supposed to be. That was the thing that told you it was real and not performance. August came, and the late summer abundance hit the trap lines with the kind of productivity that let him begin stockpiling for winter earlier than he'd managed in several years. They ran both lines together on the long days, splitting the east and west on the shorter ones. And the rhythm of the work was genuinely shared now in a way that had taken 6 months to develop, and that he would not have known to want if he hadn't improbably been given it. He was also in August building. He'd started in late June with the east wall rechinching that he'd promised her in April. From there it had expanded organically without a plan exactly, but with a direction into a more comprehensive improvement project than the cabin had received since he'd originally constructed it. A second sleeping area properly separated, wider shelving throughout. He rebuilt the outhouse structure from the foundation because it had been marginal for 3 winters, and marginal was no longer a standard he found acceptable. He dug out the root cellar a full additional foot and lined it properly for 2 people's winter stores instead of 1. She worked on these projects with him when there was work that needed 2 sets of hands. She had views on all of it, the layout of the second sleeping space, the height of the new shelving, the specific arrangement of the root cellar that made sense for how they actually used the stores, versus how he'd theoretically organized them alone. She presented her views with the flat directness he'd come to depend on, and he pushed back on some of them and agreed with others, and they built something that was neither entirely his design nor entirely hers, but was better than either would have produced alone. He thought about that sometimes while he was working. Not with sentiment, just as a practical observation about what happened when you stopped designing everything for exactly one. Late August brought a visitor. He came up the trail on a Thursday morning, a man Silas didn't recognize, well dressed for the outdoors in a way that suggested the clothes were recent purchases, which meant someone who didn't spend his life outdoors and had tried to prepare for it. He was carrying a letter case under his arm. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to being the authority in the room he was in and hadn't yet processed that there was no room here. Silas was splitting wood in the clearing when the man came out of the timber. He kept splitting. He finished the piece he was on and set them all down, and stood and looked at the man with the flat, patient attention he'd used on the mountain for 2 decades. The one that communicated without words that the person being looked at had his complete assessment and could proceed when ready. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said. "Name of Maeve Deer." "I have reason to believe she's in this area," hired man Silas said. The man blinked. "I beg your pardon. You're hired." "You're not her husband." Silas looked at the letter case. "You've got papers." The man composed himself. "I represent her husband's interests in the matter of—" "In the matter of her departure," Silas said. "I know what you represent." The cabin door opened. Maeve came out and stood on the threshold and looked at the man in the clearing, and the man looked at her, and Silas watched both of them do it. He watched her face go through something in the space of about 2 seconds. He could read her well enough now to see it, and come out the other side into something calm and decided. She came down from the threshold and crossed the clearing and stood beside Silas. Beside him, not behind him, not using him as a shield. Next to him, with her arms loose at her sides and her chin level. "Mr. Frost," she said. She knew him. He could tell she knew him from the way she said the name. "He sent you, Mrs. Deer. Your husband is concerned for your welfare." My name is Maeve Hollister," she said. "It was always Maeve Hollister." "What do you need to say?" Frost looked at the letter case, then at Silas, then at Maeve. He was calculating something. Silas could see the calculation and had a reasonable sense of what it was. He was assessing the situation, the terrain, the feasibility of whatever he'd been sent here to accomplish. "Mr. Deer has asked me to convey that he wishes you to return," Frost said. "He is prepared to be—" He chose his next word with visible care. "Generous with the terms of your return." "No," Maeve said. Frost blinked. "That's it," she said. "No, you can tell him I said so." Miss Hollister," Frost said. He shifted the letter case. "He has legal standing as your husband to what?" Silas said. The word came out quiet, not threatening, not raised. Just the question, with a quality underneath it that had nothing to do with the volume it was delivered at. Frost looked at him. He was not a small man, and he was not, Silas judged, a timid one, but he was a man who was used to operating in environments where his tools papers, legal standing, the authority of a paying client carried weight. And he was currently in an environment where those tools were approximately as useful as they would have been on the surface of the moon. "The law recognizes a husband's right to—" "The law is in Red Hollow," Silas said. "You're not in Red Hollow. You're on this mountain. And on this mountain, the only thing that decides what happens next is what that woman wants." He looked at Frost without hostility, without performance. Just clarity. She said no. That's the decision. Frost stood in the clearing for a moment. He looked at Maeve again, perhaps looking for something that wasn't there, some crack in her certainty, some signal that the no was negotiable. She looked back at him with the gray-green eyes that had never once, in the 7 months Silas had known her, wavered on something she'd made up her mind about. "You came a long way for one word," she said. "I'm sorry about that." "I mean it, but it's the only word I have for you." Frost reached into the letter case and produced a sealed envelope. "He asked me to give you this regardless of your answer." She took it, didn't open it. You can stay the night if you need rest before the trail back, Silas said. Standard hospitality, the kind the mountain required of anyone with a roof and a fire. I'll feed you, and you can sleep in the supply shelter. Frost looked at the offer and at the man making it, and seemed to understand that it was a genuine offer and not a complicated one. Thank you, he said after a moment. I'll accept that. He slept in the supply shelter and left in the morning before 7, and Silas watched him go from the clearing with the splitting maul in his hand and the morning light coming over the eastern ridge, and then went back to splitting wood because there was a winter coming and there was always work. Maeve opened the letter that evening. He was at the table working on a repair to one of the marten traps when she sat down across from him and opened the envelope. He didn't stop working. She read it in silence. He heard the paper. He heard the silence while she went through it. When she set it down, he looked up. What does it say? He said. She looked at the letter on the table. He says he loves me, she said. He says he never meant to make me feel... She stopped. She picked the letter up and looked at it again, and then set it down with the deliberate placement of something you're putting in a specific location so you know where it is. He's very convincing when he writes things down. He's always was. She looked up at Silas. He's not a monster. That's what makes it complicated. He's a man who thought he knew what I should be, and was so certain about it that he couldn't hear me telling him otherwise. 4 years of me telling him, and she stopped again. He still doesn't hear it, even in this letter. It's all about what he feels and what he wants and what he's willing to offer. Not one word about what I said I needed. Silas looked at her. You don't have to explain it to me, he said. I know, she said. I want to. She folded the letter. I want you to understand why I left and why I'm not going back. Not because I need you to give me permission to feel it, but because it matters to me that you know. He set down the marten trap. I hear you, he said. She looked at him. I know you do. She said it simply without drama, just as a statement of a fact she was confident in. It's not a small thing. I didn't always know what that felt like. He held her gaze across the table. He wanted to say something that matched the weight of what she'd said, but he didn't have the vocabulary for it, had never had it. Had deliberately dismantled most of what he'd had in that department sometime in his mid-30s when it had stopped seeming useful. What he had instead were his hands and his work and the mountain and whatever it was he'd become after 19 years of being shaped by all three. What do you want to do with the letter? He said. She looked at it. Burn it, she said. He got up and opened the stove door. She crossed to it and put the letter in, and they stood there and watched it go quickly, completely, in the way paper burns when it meets a well-maintained fire. And then she closed the stove door and stood next to him for a moment in the warmth. Thank you, she said. For the stove, he said, for all of it, she said. Since January, he looked straight ahead at the closed stove door. You did the same. You went first, she said. That mattered. He didn't have an answer to that either. So he put his arm around her shoulders, the left one, the one the shoulder had been dislocated from, the one she'd fixed in a blizzard with her hands, and the knowledge she'd gotten from watching it done with animals. And she put her head against his shoulder. And they stood there in front of the stove on a late August evening in the Blackthorn Range. Two people who had come to be where they were through a sequence of accidents and choices and small accumulated acts of trust that had added up to something that neither of them had names for and neither particularly needed to name. Outside the mountain was what it always was. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the timber was going dark, and somewhere out there, the things that lived here were doing what they did at dusk, settling, moving, hunting, existing in the complete indifference to human observers that had always been one of the things he respected most about them. He stood in his kitchen with his arm around Maeve Hollister and thought about January. He thought about the specific clarity of a bad decision being made correctly the moment when he'd seen her in the drift, and his body had started moving before his reasoning had caught up. He thought about all the ways he'd tried to stay separate from what was happening in the weeks that followed, and all the ways it hadn't worked, and the moment in April when he'd finally acknowledged out loud that he didn't want her to go. He thought about the things that had almost broken them before they'd had a chance to be anything: the food stores, the shoulder, the brewing fear about Harlan Deer and his hired man and his legal standing, and the way they'd come through each thing not unscathed, never unscathed, but intact. Nothing up here left you unscathed. That was the premise of the whole enterprise. The second winter was always different from the first in the Blackthorn. He'd noticed that pattern years ago. The first winter was survival, the raw education of what the mountain demanded and whether you had what it took to answer. The second winter was where you found out whether what you'd learned had actually become part of you, or whether you'd just been lucky the first time around. By September, they were already preparing for it, and the preparation looked different from how it had looked every previous year. The stores were calibrated for 2 from the beginning. The wood supply was targeted at 2 people's heat consumption through a hard winter. The root cellar was organized the way she'd organized it, which was better, and he'd acknowledged that in the way he acknowledged things she was right about, which was to adopt the method without annotation. He taught her the things the summer and fall had, that the winter hadn't: how to read the sky in September, when the first weather came through, which was different from reading a February system, how to manage the upper elevation sets before the first hard frost closed them down, how to assess the state of the shelter on the north line before leaving it for the winter, what repairs it would need to hold, what could wait. She learned the way she'd always learned, completely, practically, without false modesty about what she didn't yet know. She asked questions that were specific. She retained what she was told and applied it, and then built on it the next time. One morning in October early, she came back from checking the Upper East sets alone while he was breaking down the North shelter. And when they met back at the cabin, she gave him her full report on the set conditions and then said, without transition, "I saw a wolf." He looked up from the equipment he was cleaning. "On the upper run," she said, "near the 4th set. Young one, I think. It sat and looked at me for about 30 seconds before it went back into the timber." He looked at her. She had a quality in her face that was different from her normal expression, something loose in it, something that didn't usually get to be loose. "What did you do?" he said. "Stood still," she said. Looked back. He nodded. "Was it—" She seemed to be searching for the right question. "Is it rare? Up here?" "Not rare," he said, "but they don't usually let themselves be seen." It looked— She stopped. Tried again. It looked like it was deciding something. He considered that they usually are. She thought about that for a moment. Then she went to hang her coat, and he went back to the equipment, and neither of them said anything else about it, and that was fine. That was how they handled the things that were large without being complicated. You said what you had and left the rest for the air, which was big enough up here to hold anything. November came, and the first snow of the second winter arrived the way it always arrived, not as a surprise but as a confirmation. The mountain was cycling back, and the work was cycling with it, the familiar compression into what the cold required: wood, food, heat, judgment. The trap lines went to winter configuration. The stores were inventoried and found sufficient. The cabin, with its new chinking and its rebuilt spaces and its reorganized storage, was tighter than it had ever been. The first evening of real snow, they sat at the table after dinner, and she was sewing something she'd gotten into the habit of useful handwork in the evenings, a habit she'd brought with her and developed. And the evenings had long since stopped having the weighted quality they'd had in January when 2 strangers were navigating a forced proximity, and he was reading the history volume he'd read 4 times before she came, and he found, for the first time, that he was actually reading it. The words were going in and staying in. He wasn't monitoring the room. He wasn't doing the peripheral awareness thing that had characterized every evening of the first winter, that constant low-grade tracking of where she was and what she was doing. He was just reading. He became aware of this fact and sat with it for a moment. Then he turned the page and kept reading. She looked up at some point and caught him smiling slightly at something in the text and said, "What?" Something in here, he said. History of the early settlement of the Eastern Territories. The author has a particular view of fur traders that is creative. Creative how? He read her the passage. She listened and made a sound that was her version of a laugh, which had become one of the most reliable sounds in the cabin. He's never met a fur trapper, she said. No one who writes about fur trappers has ever met one, he said. What would you tell him, she said, if you could? He thought about it. That it's not romantic, he said. It's cold and it smells bad, and it's lonely, and the work is harder than anything you can put in a sentence. He paused. And it's the only life I ever wanted, and I wouldn't have traded it. She looked at him. Even the lonely part, she said. Quietly, without pressure, he thought about that answer carefully, the way he thought about things that required precision. The lonely part, he said, wasn't something I wanted. It was something I got used to because the alternative seemed like a larger risk than I was willing to take. He looked at the book in his hands and then at her across the table. I was wrong about the math on that. She held his gaze. For what it's worth, she said, I was scared too. Before, after everything with Harlan, I thought maybe I just wasn't built for the kind of thing that worked. Like maybe I'd used up whatever trust I had and there wasn't enough left to do this with. You reset my shoulder, he said. What does that? You reset my shoulder, he said again, in a blizzard. Alone, with your hands. That's not someone who's used up their capacity for things that matter. He paused. That's someone who does hard things when the hard thing needs doing. She was quiet. You're not as bad at this as you think you are, she said finally. What? Saying things, she said. The things that matter. He looked at the book. Don't push it, he said. She laughed, the real one, the short surprised one, and went back to her sewing. And he went back to his book. And the second winter of the Blackthorn settled in around the cabin with the comprehensive indifference it had always had toward the human arrangements inside it. Only now the arrangements were different. The following spring, when the trading parties first came through the pass again, Halverson stopped at the cabin the way he'd been stopping since April of the year before. And he sat at the table and drank the coffee Maeve poured him and looked at the two of them with the expression he'd been developing over multiple visits, which was the expression of a man who had seen a lot and was adding this to the list of things that had surprised him. Word's gotten around, he said, in Red Hollow and Cutter's Settlement and down in the valley. People talk. People always talk, Silas said. They talk about the trapper in the Blackthorn, Halverson said. The one who's been up here since before anyone can remember. And the woman who came over the pass in a January blizzard and didn't come back down. He looked at his coffee cup. They've got a few different versions of the story. They always do, Maeve said. The most common one, Halverson said, is that she came to the mountain and the mountain kept her. He said it plainly as a report of what was being said and waited. Silas looked at Maeve. She looked at him. The mountain kept me, she said, because I decided it was worth keeping. Halverson nodded slowly. That's what I thought, he said. That's what I'll tell them. He finished his coffee and left with his mules and his goods and his stories, and Silas and Maeve stood in the clearing and watched him go down the trail until the timber took him. Then they turned around and went back to work. There was always work. There would always be work. The mountain required it with the same relentless consistency. It had always required everything full effort, full attention, full commitment, or the consequences were real and came quickly. That hadn't changed and wouldn't change. But there was something else now that hadn't been there in any of the 19 winters before January put a dying woman in his timber and changed the calculation of everything he thought he'd settled. There was someone to come back to at the end of the line. There was someone who knew what the work cost and did it alongside him and didn't pretend it was something other than what it was. There was in the small and specific way of a well-built fire in a well-built cabin at the end of a hard day in a hard place. Enough. Silas Rourke had spent 20 years believing that the man who needed nothing was the strongest kind. He'd built himself into that man deliberately, systematically, with the same careful attention he gave to the trap lines and the winter stores and the wood supply. He'd made himself into something that could withstand anything because it required nothing. What he hadn't understood what Maeve Hollister had shown him, not in a single revelation, but in 400 small daily demonstrations spread across 2 seasons, was that withstanding everything alone was not strength. It was just a very long way of being afraid. The strongest version of him was the one standing in the clearing in the spring light watching a trading party disappear down the trail, with a woman beside him who had crossed a January mountain on a dying horse and reset a dislocated shoulder in a blizzard, and argued about knife storage and laughed at history books and chose, deliberately, with full knowledge of the cost, to stay. He hadn't saved her, she hadn't saved him. They had between them made something that neither had been able to make alone, a life that was genuinely worth surviving for. The mountain was still the mountain. It would take from them as it had always taken, without sentiment, without mercy, with the absolute consistency of something that operated by its own ancient rules and had no interest in human exceptions. But in the cabin on the north side of the Blackthorn Range, on the morning of the second spring, fire was burning and the coffee was on, and 2 people who had no business finding each other were beginning their day, the same way they'd begun every day, since January, one step at a time, together, in the particular and irreplaceable warmth of not being alone. That was all it was. It was more than enough.